one of the most unheralded episodes of the Holocaust, and now it's documented in Odyssey, a book by John Bierman, who also is responsible for writing The Righteous Gentile, story of Raoul Wallenberg, the forgotten or unforgotten hero of the Holocaust. And now he's launching another book. Well, like Homer's Odyssey, about Jason and the Argonauts going for the Golden Fleece, this is about 514 Jewish passengers going for Palestine, fleeing the puppet state of Slovakia on May 18, 1940. The British view this really as a rebellious act, a rebellion against their 75,000 limitation against immigration into Israel. Then it was called Palestine. It's heroic and sometimes tragic. There are tales of romance, sickness, mutinous sentiments, intrigue, and, as we all know, survival. It is a true tale, and one that has finally been unlocked in this book. And with that, I welcome you to the author. I welcome you with an introduction to its author, John Bierman. John, welcome to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here, and at last unravel the story of the Odyssey. My first question, after reading this, as I said, it is an unheralded episode. We really hear very little about it. Why is it such a well-kept secret?
I think you must, of course, realize that this happened during World War II, and it was just completely lost in all the dramatic, world-shattering events that were occurring at that time. And then immediately after the war, when it might have come to light, of course, you then had the very large-scale immigration to Palestine by Holocaust survivors, which was organized on a grand scale and very well financed and very well run. So all the attention went to episodes like, for example, the Exodus, the ship Exodus, which became a novel by Leon Uris. And as a lot of the people from the Penn show said to me rather ruefully, everybody knows about the Exodus, nobody knows about us. So it got buried under an avalanche of, if you like, bigger and apparently more dramatic events.
Except that almost helped facilitate their passage at the beginning when they disembarked. There were so many things happening that people really didn't take notice of this rickety riverboat leaving down the Danube.
Well, this is true, and of course the only reason they were able to get away at all was that it was, although the war had begun, and Hitler's armies were rampaging through Western Europe, the extermination policy had not yet been defined, and it was still possible for Jews to get away. If they could find some physical means of getting out, that was their problem. But the Nazis were quite prepared to strip them of everything they belonged and kick them out if they had somewhere to go to. This is a group of people, or at least the hardcore of this group of people, not those I would call the refugees, but the ideologues, the members of this Zionist youth movement, the Betar. They weren't going to wait for something to happen to them. They were determined to take their fate into their own hands, and they didn't see themselves, of course, as refugees at all. They saw themselves as pioneers, going to claim a land which, as far as they were concerned, rightfully belonged to them.
In a way, help them on the boat, because what should have taken a month, as we know when we read the book, it really took 4 years. What I don't understand is, how did the Nazis and the British allow 514 passengers to sail down the Danube?
British couldn't stop them. It was the Nazis who were in control of Central and Central Europe at that time. I think, to be fair, you shouldn't really speak of the British and the Nazis in the same breath. They were on different sides of that war. Unfortunately for the Jews of Europe, unrestricted entry into Palestine was considered by the British to be inimical to their strategic interests, and their main strategic interest was in winning the war. They were afraid that if Jews were allowed unrestricted entry into Palestine, they would have an enormous Arab revolt on their hands, which would tie down tens of thousands of troops and make it much easier for the Axis powers to perhaps to get through Egypt to the oil fields. So although this is not an excuse for British policy, it's certainly a reason for it, and as I say, I don't think it's quite fair to put them in the same breath.
You know, it isn't fair, but they were en route to Palestine, which makes their voyage a little bit different.
Yeah, sure. The British were trying to stop, absolutely, trying to stop Jews getting to Palestine, and they blockaded the coast.
Now, the Nazis, on the other hand, I remember reading in the book, they they really want to compound the problems of the British and Arabs if they did in fact let the Jews.
Sure, and this was one reason why they allowed this boat to go. They could have stopped it, of course.
Okay, now the scenario, so people have an idea of the characters. It really does read like, as I said when I met you, a movie. You think this is fiction. Unfortunately, it is non-fiction. The trailblazers, the leaders of this voyage. We have Secher, Alexander Secher, who's the leader of, at that time, the Beitar movement in that region, and Zoltan Schock, and Secher's girlfriend, Spiegel, Shoshana Spiegel.
Yes.
Secher and Schock, if you can explain their relationship.
Yes, it was a fascinating relationship, and of course, when I first met these people, who of course are still alive, I wasn't immediately aware of this old tension between them, though it still exists. But bit by bit, I came to realize that there had been this tremendous tension between them. And bit by bit, I managed to get the story out of them and from other people who were onlookers. And you had a complete contrast of two personalities. You had Secher, 22 years old, a hot-blooded zealot, a total zealot. Appropriately enough, he had a head of flaming red hair. And he was totally undiplomatic. He was a very blunt and direct person, obviously with a lot of charisma and tremendous qualities of leadership. On complimenting him in every way, because he really needed both kinds of personalities, was the, if you like, the rather more devious and older character, Schock, 12, 13 years older than him, a man of the world, a guy who'd been around, a wheeler-dealer, a diplomat, somebody who knew how to bribe, who to bribe, how much to bribe them, what to bribe them with. Some men are bribable with money, others are bribable with flattery, others want women. You name it, Schock would provide it.
And he had a certain savoir-faire about it.
Savoir-faire.
Humphrey Bogart could have played him.
And neither of these guys could have succeeded on their own. Together they made a formidable team, even though they couldn't stand the sight of each other.
The important thing, Schock really was responsible for getting those passports, those Paraguayan passports out of Slovakia state. Actually, was it in Prague?
Out of Prague, after the Nazis marched into Prague.
And people really resented him. In a way, I felt sorry for him.
Well, a lot of them didn't realize what he'd done. You know, since the book has been published, I have had letters and phone calls from people here in the States and in Israel who were on that ship, who said, you know, I didn't know, I didn't realize, you've told me things about that voyage which I had no idea about. And one of the things they didn't know about was how much Schock had been responsible for organizing this thing, because he was a guy who worked backstage in the shadows, the wheeler-dealer, the puppet master.
Any regrets from the people who wrote you, saying they felt a little bit bad?
No, I don't have, not so far, but you know, it's early days yet. I've only had a few letters and phone calls, but this has been one of the things that struck me, was that so few of them realized the power struggle that was going on behind the scenes. But this, I think, is one of the things which brings the story to life. Secher at first didn't want to tell me about his conflicts because he is still the total ideologue. He hasn't changed at all. He hasn't mellowed. He's as fierce as he ever was. He's a very attractive personality, but he's strong meat, you know.
And a buttress to his efforts is Shoshana Spiegel.
Yes. Now, Shoshana, who was the, if you like, the maid of all work, I suppose, you know, when you look back to the behavior of those times, we're talking about over 40 years ago, it was very sexist. She was, you know, she was obviously a remarkable girl whose ambitions and energies had to be kept in their place, because that was the way women were treated in those days, particularly Jewish women from traditional families. And so she was more or less, you know, Secher's helpmeet, the secretary, the girl who would type everything up for him and always be there when he needed her. She was brought up to take a back seat to the men in the family, and that was the way that she conducted her whole life. Sadly, she died before I got onto the story. She died of a stroke, I think, in December of '81. I didn't get onto the story until '83.
There's a person on the ship who, I'm telling you, these are all characters you can just pick out of Hollywood, and this one is so hard to believe that he can maneuver a ship on a drug addiction. That's Captain Markovitch.
Yes, Captain Markovitch. Yes, really, if one were a novelist making up a rich gallery of characters, would you really have the nerve to posit a one-legged white Russian morphine addict? And yet this is exactly what the man was. He had been an officer in the Imperial Russian Navy before the Soviet Revolution. He lost his right leg in a battle against the Japanese in 1904. He became a morphine addict as a result of the of a rather botched amputation, I suppose. They didn't have very advanced medical techniques in those days. And by the time he comes into the picture of our story, he's a total derelict, as much of a human derelict, if you like, as the ship which he was to command.
Who else would command her?
Who else would command her? This was a guy who'd lost his master's ticket. He couldn't find work, and so he was prepared to undertake this madcap voyage, and in fact, despite his drug addiction and his drunkenness, he remained a superb seaman, and certainly he must take full credit for just keeping this ridiculous vessel afloat. I don't think we've described the vessel, but it was a clapped-out old riverboat, a side-wheel paddle boat. It was never intended to carry human passengers. It had spent most of its life as what's known in Central Europe as a schlepper, taking coal up the Danube and perhaps bringing livestock back down. It had a draft of only 5 feet, so that it was extremely unstable, and when it had 500 people crammed aboard, it was desperately unstable, and it was constantly lurching from side to side and threatening to capsize altogether. And this is one of the reasons why it was constantly being stopped by the authorities on its tortuous journey down the Danube, because they were terrified not so much that 500 Jews would be drowned, but that the ship would capsize and block the navigation channel.
I think among some of the most salient memories of the people you interviewed was the saying, if I have it right, "No drugu strano," move to the other side.
Move to the other side.
They said if you change from your pocket.
Well, yeah, that was a slight exaggeration, but I mean, they had their first real scare. Well, apparently as they were coming down, they neared Budapest, and everybody rushed, because Budapest is a very beautiful city, and the river runs right down the middle of it. Everybody rushed to one side to have a look at the sights, and the ship almost turned turtle right there. Yeah. So they had to impose very strict discipline on movement around the ship.
The passengers, what did Secher and Schock ideally want, and what did they really get?
Well, what they wanted was the people that they originally had on their list, all these young, disciplined, highly motivated ideologues, members of Betar. What they had to take, A, to pay for the voyage, and B, out of pure humanitarian concerns, was something like 250 more people, most of whom were women, children, and old people. They originally didn't want to take anybody who wasn't fighting fit. The idea was that they were pioneers, and they were going to Palestine, and when they got to Palestine, they were going to join Urgan too. They weren't going to sit on their hands. This was a very activist movement, and for the benefit of people who perhaps don't know, they were not the mainstream Zionists, but members of the revisionist movement, which had been broken away from the main Zionist movement and headed by Zev Jabotinsky. Citron, in particular, was not entirely pleased at having to take these other people along, but he recognized the necessity to do so. But of course that made life a good deal more difficult for him, because he had complete control over his own people, but then he had a lot of totally different sort of people, many of whom were not ideologically motivated, many of whom were not Zionists at all. They just wanted to get away. They didn't give a damn where they went to, and as one of them said, Palestine, Peru, Shanghai, I didn't care where it was, I just wanted to get out.
Hamburger, I
This was
believe.
a guy called Hamburger, who's still alive. He's a very old man. He's well into his 80s. He's remarkably fit and vigorous, and lives in Cleveland. And also is wonderfully candid. I suppose at that age you can be candid. And he didn't try to put any kind of heroic gloss on his own behavior, and spoke with what I thought was a refreshing candor about the whole business.
how did you mention Jabotinsky? We may want to mention that Menachem Begin was head of the movement in Poland.
Yes,
and it was really slower at forming in Czechoslovakia, am I correct?
Well, the demographics were very different in Czechoslovakia. I mean, there was nothing like such a vast number of Jews in Czechoslovakia as there were in Poland, and also there was nothing like so much in the early days, anyway, nothing like so much anti-Semitism, and so the impulse to join a group such as Betar, which I suppose we would call in some ways an extremist group, they were certainly very hot and very zealous, was not so strong. Only the most dedicated perhaps would join it. In a country like Czechoslovakia, which until Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and set up this puppet state of Slovakia, anti-Semitism hadn't been such an enormous problem as it was to become later.
I think at this point we should point out that the passengers were actually waiting for the Pencho since September 1938, which coincided with the Munich Agreement. At this time, the Betar movement was starting to rise in Czechoslovakia. How did the passengers respond when they learned of Jabotinsky's death? I believe it was Schock who found out.
Well, certainly among the Betar people, they went into deep mourning, and Citron himself told me that was the first and only time he's ever cried as an adult, was when he learned of the death of Jabotinsky, who to him was just a hero, just the most extraordinary hero, and to all of them. He was the ideal figure they all looked up to. Citron had in fact acted as briefly as Jabotinsky's aide-de-camp on a visit to Czechoslovakia, and he'd been so tremendously thrilled to be so close to the great man as he saw him. I'm sure that many of our viewers will be aware that not everybody then or now considered Jabotinsky to be a great man. So some of them thought he was far too much of an extremist. However, but as far as many of the passengers were concerned, they couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. They viewed him in the same light. He was not a mainstream person.
In fact, Citron's parents wanted more than anything for him to come to the United States.
Yes.
They couldn't really understand his
Citron's
deal.
parents and all his brothers and sisters had come to the United States in at the end of the 20s, I think it was, in the early 30s, and they had begged him to go with them, and he'd refused, because he had no intention to go to America. Even as a child, he had only one objective, and that was to go to Palestine.
And in fact, when he was offered Boston University,
even when he was in internment later on, he turned it down. He could have come to safety here.
John, we mentioned that there were altercations. We've cited a few. This trip should have taken a month. Obviously, it took 4 years. The viewers may be wondering, why did it take so long? I would like to go into some of the tragic experiences. First, there was a shipwreck, I believe, in a little Italian island. If you could elaborate a little bit, please.
This ridiculous riverboat, which everybody who went on board had been told when they got to the end of the Danube they would then get onto a seagoing vessel. Of course, there was no seagoing vessel.
Selina.
They had to go all the way on there, or stay behind. So they went. And amazingly, this ship, the captain managed to keep her afloat. He had no navigation equipment. He had no proper charts. He had no radio. There was no life-saving equipment. There was only one lifeboat that would even float. They got as far as the Aegean Sea when I suppose the inevitable happened. The boilers burst and this clapped out old engine room, and they found themselves drifting completely without power and unable to steer the boat in a very dangerous area, because the whole of the Aegean was strewn with mines laid by the Italians, who by that time were in the war fighting the British in the eastern Mediterranean. The captain had a vague idea that there was an island somewhere in the vicinity, though they couldn't see it, and they rigged up a sail made out of old blankets stitched together, and clumsily this superb seaman managed to direct this ridiculous boat in the general direction of where he thought the island was, and sure enough, as the light began to fail, they could see the island in the distance. By the time they reached it, it was pitch dark. It was after midnight, and they ran smack into a reef, and there and then all 500 might easily have died. Fortunately, the reef was very close to the island proper, close enough for Citron to organize a gangplank to be sent over, and in pitch dark he evacuated the ship managed to avoid any panic breaking out, which in itself must be a great achievement of leadership, pure force of character. He got the women, the children, the old people off first, clambering up at pitch dark on the rocks of this island. Then the young people up from below decks. He got all 514 ashore without losing one.
Even set up the kitchen on the beach.
Well, later on, yes. When the dawn broke and they could see where they were, they realized how desperate their situation was. This island was really just a huge rock, about a mile and a half long and about half a mile wide. There was nothing growing on it but a few patches of scrub and thorn, nothing to eat. At first they couldn't find any water. The ship was about to break up on the reef, and so Citron immediately organized salvage parties to go back on board, the young men, the young, strong men, to go back on board and as quickly as they could to strip the ship of everything that might sustain life. That meant hauling out provisions. They had sackfuls of things like macaroni and beans, just starchy staple foods to keep them going, barrels of water, cooking stoves which had been bolted to the desk, tools which are vital. They had to actually dive down because by this time the ship was half full of water. They had to dive down into this murky, oily mess and see what they could find down there.
I want to add a little light to this. There was one person, I believe, Greta Ehrenfeld, who was so delighted to get rid of the bed bugs, going to find a blanket of them in the ocean.
That was afterwards, after the ship broke up, yes.
Yeah.
They had been tormented, of course.
No, at this point, his ego is terribly deflated because they've more or less voted him out of any kind of leadership capabilities. He wasn't allowed to negotiate with people. He took off with 4 others.
When they were stuck on the island, he volunteered, or he appointed himself. I think it was a question of asking permission. He took the one lifeboat and four strong men and said he would try to get help for them. And they knew by this time that they were somewhere near the island of Crete, which in fact was about 40 miles to the south of where they were. And they set off in a gathering storm, rowing towards Crete. They never made it. A great storm blew up and blew them off course out into the Mediterranean proper. They drifted for days. They were just about going mad from thirst and hunger and contemplating suicide, when suddenly rescue appeared in the form of the Royal Navy, the British Navy, sailing back towards Alexandria after carrying out a series of raids on Italian positions. And they were picked up by a destroyer.
Putting a POW.
Yeah, they reported that to the British that 500 of their compatriots were stranded on this desert island. They were put into a POW camp in Alexandria, and they knew no more of what had happened to the people from the pension until after the war. All of them joined the Free Czech Army in Egypt and fought with the British 8th Army in North Africa.
Which in itself holds some irony, since they were fighting with the British to drive the Germans out of France, and here was someone like Citron fighting the British out of Palestine. There's one tragic tale in here which really starts out almost as a honeymoon. This is on Rhodes, where there are escapees who are spared a firing squad. And then there's a couple, Sidney and Regina Fahn, and Sidney's brother Rudolph, and soon there will be their child, who stay on the island of Rhodes. What happens to them?
I think one thing that's very important that the book brings out, and I think that perhaps is not widely known, is how humane the Italians were, and how lacking in any kind of racial animosity, even though they were the closest allies of the Nazis. They never shared the Nazis' views about the Jews, or indeed about any minority group. It's essentially not in their nature, and so they treated their Jewish prisoners the same way they treated everybody else, with a good deal of common decency. And this is a fact which is not widely known. And in fact, there is a larger story behind this, which I could only just hint at in this book, but which I hope to develop in a later book.
Any hints of it? Okay, that's the next tape. You said including Mussolini's fascist officials. Did that surprise you at all?
It did at first, until I got deeper into it and realized their mindset was totally different from that of the Nazis. Totally different.
There is a story, a tragic tale with a lot of human interest, of two people. Actually, it ends up being four.
Yeah.
The Fawns.
Yes.
Regina and
Yes.
Sidney Fawn and Sidney's brother Rudolph, who decide to stay at Rhodes, on the island of Rhodes.
Well, they're able to stay on Rhodes when all the rest of the Pencho passengers are taken to a prison camp in Italy, to an internment camp in Italy, because they have a special skill which is desperately needed on that island. They are both of them experienced tanners. They know how to make shoe leather out of animal hides, and this is badly needed on the island, so they were allowed to stay as free people. And they were living extremely well and very comfortably, in spite of the wartime conditions, until Italy suddenly withdrew from the war, and the Nazis, the German army, took over the island in a sudden blitzkrieg. And even then, for a few months, there was no particular problems. There was a small Jewish community on Rhodes, an ancient community numbering about 1,000 people. But the Fawns were known as being rather different. They were called the German Jews, because they spoke German. But even then, they weren't troubled by the Germans until one day in the summer of 1944, an SS special Einsatzkommando arrived from Athens with the job of solving the, quote, Jewish problem, as if there was one, on the island of Rhodes. And all the Jews were rounded up, piled onto two coal barges, and taken several hundred miles to Athens, and then from Athens taken over 1,000 miles by train to Auschwitz. They didn't even have the decency to kill them on the spot. Sidney Fawn, his brother, Sidney's wife, Regina, and their baby, who was just a few months old, were among those who were taken. Regina and the baby were separated from Sidney and his brother when they got off the train at Auschwitz. It was, according to Sidney, it was Mengele himself who was on the platform with his long white coat and his horsewhip, saying links, rechts, left, right. The ones on the left lived, the ones on the right went straight to the gas chambers. Women with children with babies in arms went straight to the gas chambers. This was the last that Fawn saw his wife.
The unfortunate irony of this is just as the Pencho arrives in Israel around approximately
almost
the same time, almost
yeah.
the same time,
yeah.
they are swept up and rounded up
Yeah.
by the Nazis.
Yeah.
It was Carol Hoffman, the poet of the boat, whose poetry, I wouldn't say he'd be the poet laureate of England, but for the boat he was a poet laureate. He said it was the elasticity of the people that saved them.
Yeah, yeah.
Agree with that.
Their ability to bounce back when things were tough. So.
Now, as I read this, you know what kept me reading this? What comes of these people? You know, in our minds we have the impeccable leadership of Citron, of Schock, and then we have this man Hamburg who can't stand to be down under in Akko. What comes of them? Hamburger, what happens to him?
Well, Hamburger was one of the 1,000 refugees who were admitted to the United States by decree signed by President Roosevelt. They went to camp at Oswego, and he was able to remain after the war, and he said, I was very happy to have been allowed to become an American citizen. He's still alive in Cleveland. Imre
Lichtenfeld, who's the iron-pumping hero of the ship.
Yes, the Schwarzenegger.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Well, he became he developed a system of unarmed combat called Krav Maga, and he became the chief instructor to the Israeli Defense Forces in this particularly lethal martial art, and he has instructed generations of Israeli commandos in how to kill a man with one poke of your little finger. He's now retired and trying to set up his own gymnasium in the city of Netanya.
In Citron, really just...
Citron never, through no fault of his own, was able to achieve the early promise he showed, partly because of his uncompromising nature. He could have been big in politics, he could have been, a brilliant soldier. He was never prepared to make the compromises which are necessary to advance in this world.
Unfortunately, I have to make a compromise. We have run out of tape, and as I said before, I think we could easily sit here for 2 hours discussing the book. I do anticipate a film coming out, and if it doesn't, I will single-handedly see to it that it is produced. John Bierman, thank you so much for being with us. And for Focus, I'm Deborah Palmer.